Hello, it's Mr. Drake, and I've got a great book to share with you today. It's a book called Christmas Tapestry by Patricia Polacco. And it's a book that I gave to our children Christmas of 2002 to Nicholas, Elizabeth, and Hannah. Love, Mom and Dad. And we have a tradition in our family where we give one gift that we open on Christmas Eve. And it's always a book, a new Christmas book, and we sit together and read it. So this was the one we gave that year, and it's through the years become one of our favorites. So it's by Patricia Polacco, who is a Michigan author, and she's also the illustrator. That's one of the great things about her books, is that she writes and illustrates them. So here we go. Find the first page here, and we'll start off with the book, A Christmas Tapestry. There are those who say there's no balance in the universe and that all things happen randomly without purpose. Take, for instance, one Jonathan Jefferson Weeks. He was most upset that his family came all the way from Memphis, Tennessee, when his father accepted the position of pastor at the New Baptist in Detroit. Even though their new home was on the outskirts, it was still Detroit. Nothing like Tennessee. What possible good reason could there be for leaving home and coming here? Jonathan Jefferson Weeks' father's church in Tennessee had been so beautiful, new and gleaming. Everyone had loved to come to his father's services, and Jonathan loved his school. He had just made it on the soccer team, and even though he was a PK, a preacher's kid, his friends didn't treat him any differently than anyone else. Here in Detroit, Michigan, his father's new church was practically falling down. It was rickety and old, and the parsonage was right next door. Here, everything about their life screamed PK. "Why did we have to come here, Daddy?" Beth asked her father after dinner one night. "The church looks awful. Nobody comes to the services." "The deacon sent your father here because this little church is in such need of new life," Jonathan's mother said. "Your father made our church in Memphis into something beautiful, didn't he? You should have seen it when we first arrived there." "It couldn't have been as bad as this place," Jonathan said. "Oh, but it was, Jonathan. Worse." His father smiled. Their parents took them into the living room and pulled out a photo album from one of the packing boxes. Jonathan and Beth couldn't believe their eyes. Their father was right. The Tennessee church had been worse. Far worse. "How did you do it, Dad?" Jonathan asked. "Just the way I'm going to do it here. But I need both of you to help me. There's the hard work that it's going to take to repair and rebuild this church, but I'll also need you to be cheerful and brave. When you see what we're going to do with this church, your spirits will be lifted." Beth and Jonathan tried to smile. "I predict by, let's see, this very Christmas, their church will be something that we will all be proud of," their father said. "When it is finished, people will come. You'll see." Even though Beth and John missed Memphis, they drew themselves into the tasks that were assigned them. For that whole summer, they both helped clear out trash, cut back bushes, mow lawns, and plant bulbs for the next spring. They scrubbed floors, washed walls, and even helped with the painting. When school started, they were so involved with the rebuilding of the church, they didn't even miss their old friends. They were making new ones. By fall, not only was the church looking better, but Sunday services were getting more and more crowded. Jonathan's father was just what this neighborhood needed. Folks were very friendly now, and everyone was anxious to help. Even Jonathan's new classmates came to help paint. It seemed that everything that the neighbors and friends and family did was turning the church into a beautiful place. As fall stretched into winter, the church was almost finished. Jonathan's father was right. It would be perfect for Christmas. "Here, Dad," Jonathan said as he handed up a loaded paintbrush to his father on a step ladder one December day. Reverend Weeks dabbed the last spot of paint on the sacristy wall. "There. Now the artist can paint the wonderful scene we've planned," he said. "It's going to be a glorious painting of our Lord." Jonathan could hardly wait to see the painting, and it would be done in time for Christmas Eve. Jonathan walked over to the window and watched the snow steadily falling outside. "I've heard that a blizzard may be coming, Dad. And here in Michigan, a blizzard can be real bad." "I've heard that too, but the parsonage is warm and cozy, "And so is our new church," Reverend Weeks said as he hugged Jonathan. "It won't bother us, will it?" The next week brought the worst snow that they had seen in Detroit in 25 years. One morning, Mr. Brown, the caretaker, knocked on the parsonage door. He looked full of dread. "Reverend Weeks, come quickly." Jonathan, Beth, and their parents rushed next door. As they entered the church, they all gasped. A dark water stain covered the sacristy wall, right where the painting of our Lord was to be. "Ice built up on the edge of the roof and held back water," Mr. Brown said sadly. "Standing water that ran into the building and down the sacristy wall." "How can this be happening?" Mrs. Weeks cried. "The artist we commissioned to do the painting was going to start tomorrow." "Isn't there anything we can do?" the Reverend asked Mr. Brown. "We can chip the ice to let out the standing water on the roof." He lightly pushed the watery wall. There was a huge crack and a rush of water, and a piece of plaster fell with a thud. "Dad!" Jonathan cried out. "Now there's a big ugly hole in the wall, right where everyone will see it. I even see the wooden slats." "I know a plasterer, Mr. Zucker. He'll be able to fix it for us," Mr. Brown said. "Before Christmas Eve?" Jonathan asked, full of hope. "No, sir," Mr. Brown said. "This here wall needs to dry out first. The plastering may not be until spring." "I knew something would spoil our Christmas," Jonathan cried. Now. I'll call Mr. Zucker anyway. He may have a different solution," Mr. Brown added softly. Later that night, Reverend Weeks sat at the edge of Jonathan's bed. "I miss home," Jonathan cried. "I know you believe God always has a plan, but what plan could have brought us here?" Jonathan sobbed. "We worked so hard. Then God sent a blizzard. I don't understand." "Well, son, although we don't always understand how the universe unfolds as it should. Well, son, although we don't always understand, the universe unfolds as it should," his father said as he rocked the boy in his arms. "Tomorrow will be another day, and perhaps things won't seem so bleak when you wake up to a new morning." Then he kissed the boy good night and closed the door. The next morning, Jonathan woke to a cold snap and freezing snow. His mother asked his father and him to drive to Detroit to pick up Christmas decorations that she had ordered from Horrocks. Jonathan didn't want to go. He felt so bad about the church wall. What good would decorations do? Then, as if the damage to the church wasn't bad enough, the battery was dead in the family car. "It's all right, Jonathan. We can take the bus." Jonathan's face fell. "The slow old bus all the way downtown and back? Why do we need decorations? The church is ruined. Everybody will just sit and look at the hole in the wall," Jonathan said, as they boarded the bus. Downtown, Jonathan and his father slogged through freezing snow. The wind stung their faces. After they had picked up the decorations, they stepped into an alley to get out of the bitter wind. It wasn't an alley, really, because it was lined with odd little shops, antiques mostly. Jonathan and his father leaned against one of the windows and caught their breath for a moment. Jonathan turned toward the window, and that's when he saw it. There was the most beautiful-looking piece of cloth Jonathan had ever seen. "Dad, look!" Jonathan pulled his father to see. "Isn't it magnificent?" his father said. "Wait! If that cloth is big enough, couldn't we buy it and hang it over the hole in the wall?" Jonathan pleaded. "The colors even look like Christmas." "Sorry, son. I have $15 and some change for the bus. That cloth looks like it would cost more than I can afford." He looked in the boy's eyes, so disappointed now. "Well, at least we can go in and look." The shopkeeper spread the beautiful cloth out on a table. "Look, Jonathan, hand-stitched embroidery," Reverend Weeks said as he gazed at the clock. "And the perfect size, Dad, see?" Jonathan said as he touched it. Reverend Weeks looked up. "How much is this?" he asked timidly. "I've had that old piece here for over a year. For you, Pastor, I'll make it a deal. How's $15 sound?" "That would be fine, perfectly fine," Reverend Weeks beamed as the shopkeeper wrapped the beautiful tapestry in brown paper. "Jonathan, you had an inspired idea," his father said, as they made their way to the bus stop. Jonathan and his father waited at the bus stop. The wind burned as it stirred up waves of crystal snow. Reverend Weeks stepped into the street and leaned out to see if a bus was coming, but there was no sign of it. Do you think with the weather that the weather is so bad they've stopped the bus service? Jonathan asked his father. No, it's late. I'm sure it's just late, his father reassured. Jonathan shivered in the bitter wind. It's always late, a voice came out of the white, misty snow. There on the bench was an old lady. The bus! It's always late, she cried again as she motioned toward them. Reverend Weeks smiled at her. Jonathan tried to stand behind his father out of the bitter wind. In my country, winters are worse than this. Like a razor the wind cuts. I have hot tea in my thermos and some raisin cookies, too, she said as she motioned them to sit with her. Have some with me. I would like nothing more this day than to share a little warm tea with you and your boy. Jonathan looked at his father. Please? Please, he whispered. We're much obliged, ma'am, the Reverend Weeks said as he tipped his hat. The hot tea and cookies made the wind seem to disappear. How far have you to go today? That is, if the bus ever gets here, Jonathan asked the lady. Well, first the 52, then 2 transfers before I'll be home, she answered. Ma'am, if this bus comes, the way is shorter to my house, Reverend Weeks said. I have to drop off this package at my church, but I have a car there, and by now the battery is charged. I would be pleased indeed if you would to take you home in return for your kindness. In this cold, I will accept, I surely will, she said with a broad smile. If the bus ever comes, the 3 of them said in unison and laughed. The bus finally did come, and the 3 of them rode through the light snow to Reverend Weeks' church to drop off the package. Mrs. Weeks made more hot tea and shared some special cakes, too. Can we put up the cloth, Dad, before we go? Just to see what it will look like, Jonathan pleaded. He could hardly wait. Well, I'm in no hurry, the woman smiled. Jonathan and his father hung the cloth right over the gaping hole. Our Christmas tapestry, Jonathan announced. The old lady gasped. Where did you get this? She asked breathlessly. She looked pale as snow. From an antique store, just before we met you, Jonathan said to her. The old lady walked up to the cloth, took out a pair of glasses and looked at it closely. I made this, she said in a whisper. Tears streamed down her face. In Germany, almost 60 years ago, I sewed it with my own hands. She held the cloth in her gnarled fingers. My applique, my family symbols. There, do you see, child? Are you sure? Reverend Weeks asked. This was impossible. She lifted one of the corners and looked, then sighed. Those are my initials. Jonathan could see 3 letters. I stitched them there myself when I was about to become a bride. Reverend Weeks started to take the tapestry down. Surely, then, you should have this blessed cloth back. The woman thought for a moment, then moved away. No, here it belongs. Somehow it has made a journey all the way from Germany. And it was meant to be here on your wall, in this place, in this time. I can feel it. Her voice trailed off. She took her seat again and sipped her tea. Many years ago, when I married, this was used as my wedding chuppah, the canopy over me and my beloved. Then it was the coverlet on our marriage bed. Then, if there had been children, they would have been wrapped in this to be named. Her voice trailed off. Her jaw tightened. But then the Nazis came. My people were rounded up, herded like animals. The SS came first for our neighbors, and finally for us. What happened? Jonathan asked as he squeezed his father's hand. When they came, my young husband was torn from my arms. We were separated. All the women and children were thrown into one railroad car, the men and boys into another. I shall never forget his sweet eyes, the way he looked at me. I never saw him again. We were all sent out to concentration camps. She pulled up her sleeve and showed a row of faded blue numbers on the inside of her lower arm. I'm speechless. No words can describe, Reverend Weeks said as the whole family leaned toward the lady. Jonathan beamed as he looked into his father's face. Then he hugged the old woman. Would you stay for prayer services tonight, the Reverend Weeks suddenly asked, and have supper with us too? I am honored you ask, but I am not of your faith, the old woman said. Tonight I will say my own prayers, light the menorah, and share some of your lovely tea cakes with my cats. But another time I would love to share a feast with you. Do you have family to share your holidays? Reverend Weeks worried. No, husband, I never married again. But I do have nieces and nephews here in Detroit. We shall cherish this wondrous tapestry. And even if our wall is repaired, we shall keep this hanging here to commemorate your memories, dear lady, Reverend Weeks whispered. The whole family drove home with her. It was Christmas Eve. There was to be a pageant. Jonathan was going to be a shepherd in the procession of the Christ child. Beth and her mother were practicing their hymns for the choir. The service was to commence promptly at 6 o'clock. That morning there was a knock at the front door. Mr. Brown had brought the plasterer to inspect the damage. We didn't expect you to come here on such short notice, and especially on Christmas Eve, Reverend Weeks said as he shook the man's hand. Zucker, Joachim Zucker, the old man said. For me it is the festival of lights. I live alone. No one will miss me today, Mr. Zucker said, with a warm smile. This is where the damage is, Reverend Weeks said as they all entered the church together. Reverend Weeks pulled the tapestry back so the man could see the hole in the wall. Mr. Zucker put on his glasses and inspected the damage very carefully. This won't be difficult. Not difficult at all, he said. You need to let the wall dry a bit, but I can make it look like new. I'm glad to hear that. We were also worried the damage was structural, Reverend Weeks said as he let the tapestry cascade back in front of the hole. The old man staggered back. Where did you get this? Where? Right here in Detroit, Jonathan tried to explain. It couldn't possibly be, Mr. Zucker interrupted. Couldn't be what? Jonathan asked. My bride. In the old country, Mr. Zucker said softly. She made something exactly like this for our wedding. Every stitch and pattern. All the same. Mr. Zucker started to cry. But she was taken by the Nazis. We all were, he said breathlessly. We were herded like sheep into boxcars and taken to camps. Work camps, they called them. But they were a place of death. I never saw her again. She did not survive that place. Jonathan looked in astonishment at his father and mother. Did she embroider her initials in the cloth? Reverend Weeks asked. Why, yes, she did. How do you know that? Mr. Zucker asked. Jonathan pulled up the lower corner. Mr. Zucker started sobbing. R.H.Z. Those are her initials, Rachel, Hannah Zucker. The old man said as he collapsed into the first pew. Mr. Zucker, she's alive. She was just here 3 days ago. We know right where she is, Jonathan said as he hugged Mr. Zucker. The Weeks family drove like the wind with their precious cargo, Mr. Zucker, and they arrived at the front of a red brick apartment house where the old lady lived. The old man flew up to the outside door and then climbed 3 flights of stairs as if he were floating. Jonathan and Beth were out of breath. Mr. Zucker stopped in front of number 22. He waited for the longest time. Then he knocked and the door opened. There the old woman stood puzzled. Her eyes widened. Then, her eyes brimming, she took his face in her hands. Is that you, my beloved? She whispered. I have waited a long time. My Rachel, was all Mr. Zucker could manage to say. Then a sound came from both of them that Jonathan knew he would never hear the likes of again. It was the sound of joy. Then they hugged and cried and kissed each other so tenderly that Jonathan didn't really know why, but he felt tears in his own eyes. Later that night at the Christmas services, the candles were radiant. Their flickering light made the tapestry shimmer as if it were enchanted. Maybe it was, Jonathan thought as he smiled to himself. He couldn't take his eyes off of it. The pageant was beautiful. The church was full of people singing praises. The lights on the Christmas tree reminded Jonathan of twinkling stars in the night sky. Jonathan Jefferson Weeks thought his heart would burst with pure joy of the season and the wonder of all the events that had taken place. Now he knew exactly why they had moved to Detroit exactly when they did. He knew why the plaster fell, why the car didn't start, why it was so bitter cold that he and his father had shared tea with a lonely old woman. It was all so seamless, woven so perfectly, woven as beautifully and surely as Jonathan's radiant cloth that hung at the front of the church. It was all truly a Christmas tapestry. And that's the end of the story. At the back, it's got an end note that says, Patricia Polacco adapted this story from a tale she had heard in homilies once in the 1960s from Dr. Clarence Riedelbach at the Oakland Ecumenical Council, and once in the 1990s in Robert Schuller's Hour of Power. Both presentations were told as true stories involving young ministers, one from Canada, the other from New York. Miss Polacco has adapted the tale for young readers and changed the setting to her home state of Michigan. Well, that's the end of that story. I hope you enjoyed it as much as we always do. I managed to hold it together pretty well to read this. And I hope you have a wonderful Christmas season, and I look forward to coming back and sharing some more stories with you.